And we are live. Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon if you're dialing in from a place where it's already full daytime. Thank you very much for being here. We see a lot of people have already joined. Wonderful, very much welcome. We know that there's still a lot of people also joining, so let's give them 10 more seconds, and then we're going to get started. If you have any problems hearing my audio or seeing our video, then you can use the chat. We've got an administrator, Levi, in the back who can help with any advice required. All right, so we are going to get started. Very much welcome again to this WorkFlex powered webinar about these big changes around A1s. No A1 certificate required for trips under 3 days, right? Or not, or when, and what exactly. That's exactly the topic for today. And who do you have in front of you? Well, I'll start. My name is Pieter Mande. I'm Dutch. That's why there's this funny E in between the I and the T. It's very normal here. It might not be so normal for you. So I'm dialing in from my home office here in Amsterdam. My background is a tax lawyer. Used to work at PwC, PricewaterhouseCoopers, for a pretty long time, 13 years, both in the Netherlands as well as in Germany. And my last role there was tax director, responsible for the remote work proposition of PwC in Germany. But then in 2025, I co-founded WorkFlex. And as you know, WorkFlex supports employers with global mobility compliance through our platform. And I brought with me today Frank. Frank, you can introduce yourself.
Yeah, warm welcome also from my side. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Frank Jura. I'm dialing in here from my home office close to Munich. I'm the VP Compliance. I recently joined WorkFlex. My background is over 20 years in the global mobility industry. I held positions at relocation management companies, the Big Four advisors, and legal companies. And yeah, I have a true passion actually to combine everything that is cross-border work and make it easy. So hence the best place for me to be is obviously with WorkFlex. So I'm looking forward for today's session, and hopefully we get a lot of questions from your end.
Yes, very good. Thank you very much, Frank. Yes, on questions from your end. So I'm going to talk you through the agenda, but if you have any questions now, later during the session, especially at the end, we've got the Q&A, but really don't hesitate to ask any questions that you have here in the chat. There's actually two options for it. You can just use the chat, or there is a questions button also on your right button. That's at least where it should be, where you can also put in your questions. And well, especially Frank will keep an eye on those during the session, moderate so that we address them at the appropriate moment. Also, like I said, if you have any audio or video or connection issues, you can raise questions there. Then we've got Liva, our administrator, also online, who will try her very best to help you overcome those issues. All right, the agenda for today, we've got 41 minutes left and quite a long agenda, but like the true magic lies at number 4 and 5, I would say. Number 1, what is an A1 certificate, is just to refresh a little bit, make sure that we've got the basics right here. Number 2, the EC regulations 883 and 987, the actual origin of this A1 topic at all. The amendment procedure that is now reaching its final stages and where the whole fuss comes from, really. Number 4, the current status of that amendment procedure and the expectations that we have. Look, we can't look into the future, but we do think we have our opinion and expectations as to what's going to happen when around this amendment procedure. And then, of course, the suggested A1 changes. That's what it's all about. What is currently proposed in that amendment? And like I said, at the end of the Q&A, but we'd much rather do the Q&A throughout the entire session. I mean, Frank and myself, we love hearing ourselves talk, but we're rather here to do this for you. So if there's any question that pops up, just put them in the chat or in the questions part, and we'll try to answer them as best as we can. All right, diving in. What is an A1 certificate? You can see a picture here of an A1 certificate. It is a confirmation of the continued social security coverage of an employee, even when this individual is working from abroad for some time. So it says, Frank, you're going on a trip from Germany to Italy, but during this trip to Italy, you will remain socially secured in Germany like you always are, like you normally are. So your request is usually as an employer. There are some countries where you can also request an A1 as an employee. Of course, we as WorkFlex do this on behalf of our clients, not just on a daily basis, like every second we request an A1. And you request this with the Social Security authority that is appointed for this in your country. In Germany, we're talking health insurance companies. In the Netherlands, it's the National Social Security Authority. And it differs a little bit per country where you apply for it, but it's usually the Social Security, like a Social Security authority. And those authorities are also the one issuing it. Sometimes it goes really fast and online, like in Germany. Sometimes it's still online, but not so fast, like in the Netherlands. Sometimes it's entirely in a hard copy version. You get things in paper. Depends again per country. So an A1 is a COC. So every A1 is a COC, but not every COC is an A1. COC stands for Certificate of Coverage. So an A1, like I said, it's a certificate confirming coverage. So it is a COC. The difference between an A1 or a COC is that the A1 is the European version of the A1. So if of the COC. So if people are traveling within the EU region, you request for an A1. As soon as either of the two, the origin country or the destination country, is outside of the EU, we're talking about a COC. And it's very important to keep in mind that the changes that we're talking about today only cover A1s. They do not cover COCs because they origin from a different source. They origin from the bilateral social security treaties between, for instance, Germany and the US and the Netherlands and China. The A1s, they originate from two EC regulations, namely the numbers 883 from 2004 and its implementation regulation 987 2009. So 883 is the one around coordination of social security across the EU. It's kind of the most important regulation for this purpose because it actually says what we want to achieve. However, 987 is practically more important because it's the implementation of that EC regulation 883. You can see the number of years actually that went along after the first coordination regulation was agreed upon in 2004, and how long it took for the EU to actually agree upon the implementation for this coordination in 2009. It's this implementation regulation that actually originates or that introduces the A1. And you can see the picture here on the slide. Article 15 of this EC regulation says somewhere, it's underlined in yellow, that an employee or an employer shall inform the competent institution of the member state whose legislation is applicable thereof, whenever possible in advance. So employers, you preferably in advance, you inform the competent authority, health insurance, social security authority, of a trip abroad. And then in pink underlined, you see that authorities are, upon that request, required to provide information about that applicability, yes or no. And that is the A1 certificate. So where does the fuzz around A1s at the moment come from? It's about an amendment of these two regulations, 883 and 987. And the objective of that amendment is, you can see it here, it's twofold. Well, there are many minor objectives to it as well, but like the major objectives of this amendment procedure is modernizing the EU law on social security, basically just implementing learnings from the past decades when 883 was live, and also just adopting or modernizing it because the world has changed, digitalized mostly, of course, but also to facilitate administrative simplicity and enforceability of the rules. There's actually two things in here, and it's very important. Of course, they want to facilitate administrative simplicity, reduce the administrative burden for employers and employees, but also the enforceability of the rules. As you know, today, Social Security authorities, there's relatively little enforcement of the Social Security rules. That is going to change, or that's the objective of this amendment procedure. Yes, we want to reduce the administrative burden, but we also want to enable the authorities that are appointed to deal with Social Security in that country to better enforce the rules. Now, this amendment procedure, you can again see it from the title, 2016, it has been ongoing for quite some time, but, and that's where the fuss comes from, there has now finally been a provisional agreement around this amendment procedure. And that's where a lot of media and companies and organizations have picked up this thing around, oh no, it's going to be there, a lot of simplification, etc.
Yeah, maybe Peter, I think it is really important for everyone, even if it's a simplification, to really look into the details, because I also saw all the big headlines. Unfortunately, it's not that simple as some of those headlines suggest.
No, exactly right, and we'll see that over the next slides. It's easy to put in a headline, but it's a little bit more difficult really digging into the details. I personally have done that last week in my evenings, reading through the exact proposals of the text. I did that because you don't have to, dear audience. I really like it, but of course I understand that I do not share that enthusiasm widely about like diving through the documents. But if you really go through the documents in detail, yeah, things are a little bit different, or there's nuance at least. And today we want to give you that nuance. So it starts with the nuance around the simplifications are going to be there. Because yes, there is now a provisional agreement. It's a big milestone, truth be told. However, it's not live yet, right? The European Parliament and the European Council still need to adopt this amendment. That's one. And this procedure, it's already been ongoing for 10 years, and that's not for nothing. Exactly at this point, an earlier agreement actually failed to be adopted, and it was sent back. And now we see the result of this. Also, throughout the entire procedure, a lot of countries had comments as to, well, why is my sector, construction, we'll come to talk about it, is it excluded? I've got a lot of construction. There has been a lot of disagreement around this topic. So that's why it's really a sensitive amendment procedure, and it's really not that clear if it will be adopted, or if it will be adopted in the way that it is formulated now. Yes, I do believe, very personal, and like I said, I can't look into the future. I think it has, the odds of being adopted are a lot bigger than the last time, for the obvious reason that, look, they may be a little bit slow, the legislators in the EU, and they might have difficulties to agree at sometimes. However, they're not stupid. And of course, if a proposal has already failed at exactly this stage, you do not go in very ignorant again, right? So my expectation, my personal expectation, is that the people behind this who've been driving this amendment procedure, they have been pulling on some ropes and making some chats left and right behind the scenes, making sure that now this proposal, once it's provisionally agreed upon, will actually be adopted by the Parliament and the Council. So I think on average, my expectation would be, yes, there's going to be some amendment that's going to be adopted. It might change a little bit, but of course you don't know for sure. So if it's adopted, then EC regulations, they have direct legislative effect. That means they do not need to be translated into national law like EU directives need to. So it's basically immediately a law. They also come into force, EC regulations, quite quickly. So probably over the next this calendar year at least, I'm expecting the European Parliament and the Council to adopt the amendment, and that it actually goes into force as well still this calendar year. However, that doesn't mean that any of the changes that we're going to talk about next will apply very quickly, because in the law proposal, there is already an implementation period included of at least 24 months. So it says, look, the EC regulation will come into force, but the actual applicability of the rules around the A1, the adjustments around the A1, they will take another 24 months to actually go live. And it's the last bullet on this slide. We have seen such implementation periods being extended quite drastically. So if you remember at the beginning, we had the coordination EC regulation 883/2004. Well, the implementation is done through the other EC regulation that we're talking about today, and it took 5 years. The ETIAS, this new, let's say, ESTA thing for Europe, right? It has been already extended, the implementation period, for more than 6 years. So we might as well see the implementation period for these A1 changes being extended, especially if they're aiming to also unify the application processes for A1s across the EU region through a platform. Unfortunately, the trend is not the EU's friend when we're talking technology platforms, then it'll probably take much longer to be implemented. So it's unclear, but it's important to remember, well, first, it has not been adopted, and even if it's going to be adopted, it'll take years for the adjustments to actually become applicable. All right, over to the suggested A1 changes. And there are 3 major changes that we're addressing here today. So the first one is, well, that is true. Short trips, they will no longer require an A1 certificate. And what are short trips? They're basically trips that are no more than 3 days or 3 consecutive days of work in a period of 30 consecutive days. It's an important addition to make, because obviously a trip is short, great, under 3 days of consecutive work days. So that would make this trip exempted, no? Well, it depends, right? That's the always like the usual answer from a lawyer. You will have to count to make sure that you're within the 30 consecutive days here.
Hey Peter, just a quick question. So what does it actually mean? So if I travel the first 3 or 4 days, and then later in the 30 days, which is actually not a calendar month, right? Another 2 days. How would that work? Can you maybe give a little bit more as an example? Because in the past you basically just literally looked what is the trip, and then you got your A1, and you were not concerned about specific days whether you need one or not, right? Because you needed one from the first day. So
yeah, correct. Yeah, very good question, Frank. And the truth is, so logically we can make a couple of assumptions here, but it's not entirely clear. So it looks like, also based on the regulations around 183 days, that the formulation in the article is that you have to count these 30 days as a rolling 30-day period. So you're always going to look 30 days back and 30 days to the future in order to make the determination, are we talking about 3 in 30 days, yes or no? But that might lead to the situation, exactly like you said, that for the first trip, nothing's wrong. You just go on a 2-day trip and you say, oh, well, I can count. 2 is less than 3. There was no travel from Germany to Italy before, so no problem. But then it turns out that after that first trip, well, Frank is going to go back to Italy once or maybe even 2 times more. And that's where you cross the threshold. How does that work for your first trip? That retrospectively then required an A1 upfront. It's impossible to do that, obviously. So that's a little bit unclear. Logically, if you say, look, if something is impossible because you only determine afterwards that an A1 was required, yeah, there's going to be an exemption for that too, because you can't do magic. You will not be able to retrospectively apply for an A1 upfront. So it's a little bit unclear how to exactly count the days and how this works, but yeah, like I said, based on the logic that we see in the law for 183 days already, or just logic as in what we find logical as people, you can make a couple of assumptions. Important exemption for this exemption, so accepted from this exemption, is the entire construction sector. And the reason for that is that data shows the EU or the legislator that this is the sector where there's a lot of fraud taking place around this topic, and also where there are quite some heavy accidents, so social security triggering issues in that sector. And that's why they say, look, short trips are not excluded for that sector.
Yeah, I think, Peter, there was a question from Archie exactly about the construction sector. So I think it is answered. This basically doesn't fall under this new regime, so you still need an A1.
Well, yes and no, because that brings me to exception 2. Good news for you, Archie. So the exception for construction sector only goes for short trips, but there's a second exception in the proposal. And I think that's what a lot of people have gotten wrong so far. They just say it's a short trip. From the current formulation of the legal text, it says not only short trips are exempted, but also business trips, regardless of their duration, and also applicable for the construction sector. So if this director would go on a business trip, he would also be exempted from the A1 obligation. So just quickly to the standard here. So we're talking qualifying business trips. The new EC regulation will include a definition around business trips. And what it will clearly say is that as soon as there's providing of services, it will not qualify as a business trip. So it is really important that if in your mind, dear audience, a business trip is, look, our company, we only have regular business trips. Well, that's good for regular speaking and talking to your colleagues. But for the A1 legislative part, you have to very clearly check if this trip qualifies as a business trip for that too. And as soon as there's providing of services, revenue generating things taking place, it does not qualify as a business trip. And it will not be exempted on this basis. It could still be exempted on this basis if it's a really short trip though. Also from the text, workations, they will not qualify as business trip because a business trip is a trip initiated by the employer. A workation is not initiated by the employer. What is a business trip? You can see it here in the last bullet. From the text, they say, well, for instance, meetings, events, and conferences, or also receiving training that is qualified as business trips. But it's not a full definition of what business trips are. It's, to be fair, quite unclear where a regular trip or where a business trip becomes a trip that would not qualify for this definition. Definitely some unclarity around that. And
I think this will be certainly one of the main challenges later to clearly identify whether this can be classified as a business trip. Let's see how they will work with that.
Yeah, exactly that. And for instance, the example, thank you for sharing, RG, is that a company director going on a site visit, yeah, I would assume this person is not necessarily providing services. At the same time, it's also not just a meeting. It's also not an event or a conference. So yeah, at the moment, it's unclear. Thankfully, like I said, there's 24 months of implementation foreseen. So I'm hoping that at least throughout that period, we'll get more clarity on the exact definition and its coverage of what a business trip is and what is not.
Yeah, there's another question about research analysts going into EU markets to make market research, gathering data. Would that qualify as a business trip? I would say most likely not, because it's generating clearly, I mean, it's work, right? So they clearly do what they're supposed to do, not drinking coffee and eating cookies.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I'm absolutely with you. I hate the answer, it depends, but it's really the answer that we have to give now at the moment. So what the exact text does say, it says business meetings, but I think there's a very clear difference between internal business meetings, which I think will be generally exempted, versus external business meetings, like you visiting a client, or maybe your example, Archie, a company director visiting a work site. But the truth is, it's not really clear at the moment. And the last fundamental change is that there will now be a clear and strong obligation to actually apply for the A1 certificates prior to the trip. If you remember all the way at the beginning, I showed you this EC regulation article 15 that it says, well, preferably in advance, you request this A1, it will be changed, and it will clearly say you should inform the Social Security authorities upfront. A hard obligation to apply before the trip, and of course, logically, this combined with the increased enforceability and data sharing, the modernization, right, was also an objective. The data sharing across countries of this topic will make this a real hard requirement that you really need to do it.
Hey, Peter, is it clear what upfront means? I mean, basically a day before, 5 days before, or just days before you enter?
Yeah, I guess minutes before you enter would at this point theoretically work. The good news is that in most countries, once you apply for an A1, you immediately get the confirmation of application. You don't immediately get the A1, but you will get a confirmation saying, thanks, dear WorkFlex or dear employer, you've applied for an A1. And that is quite strictly what the law now requires. So if you are about to enter Italy at 10:30 this morning and you're requesting the A1 and you're getting the confirmation of application at 10:27, yeah, you've fulfilled the law. Looks like it. Not the most beautiful decision tree, but I think it's the correct one. And I've tried to make it easier, but I failed. I think this is actually the most, like the easiest way still to show this, but it kind of implies already that, yeah, there's simplification here, envisioned at least, but it's overall not that simple. But you start at the top in this decision tree. So you have to ask yourself always, is it a trip of maximum 3 consecutive days of work in this 30-day consecutive time period? If yes, you would go to the A1 certificate exemption unless you're in the construction sector. If you're in the construction sector, you go to the business trip part, which is exactly where you would also end up with if the trip is longer than 3 days or exceeds this 3 days in 30-day consecutive time period threshold. And that second question that you would then ask yourself is, are we talking about a business trip, yes or no? If yes, exemption, regardless of duration, or no, and then there's no exemption, but there's a hard obligation to apply for the A1. So this is how it's supposed to go down based on the currently proposed text of the law.
Hey, Peter, we have another question. Marianne is asking whether any fines are planned if you don't apply for the A1 upfront.
A good question. It's not in the EC regulation at the moment, but yeah, we're not talking fines usually, but there are consequences. And there are also consequences already today of not applying for an A1. And so the problem is that without an A1, and I think I saw also somewhere in the regular chat a comment about it already, is that there's no penalty from it, but the logical consequence of not having the A1 would be the obligation to pay Social Security contributions in the destination country. That's kind of your penalty. You're going to have to pay the Social Security contributions over there, and that's quite expensive. I think already you've lost, of course, once you are being asked for the A1, and you can't show it. The whole discussion you've already lost is going to cost time and money. I'm not expecting that you wouldn't be let into the country. What we do see in practice already today is that a lot of clients of our clients request the traveler to bring an A1, for instance, to a work site. And if you can't bring it today, you're already not allowed into the work site. But I can only imagine that going forward, those clients are going to be even stricter and say, well, look, today, A1s, we can be a little bit soft like the authorities are. If you can't bring it now, you can retrospectively apply for it. We should be fine. But going forward, once this is live, I think they will be very strict and exactly say, look, you don't have to pay me money. I'm not the Social Security Authority. I'm not going to ask you to pay the contributions, but you're not going to enter this worksite. So this whole trip was for nothing. So I think that's mainly the risk that we're talking about, apart from the fact, of course, you can even argue, would your individual or your employee be socially insured during the trip? I don't think that's a discussion you would want to have with your employee, because that discussion only comes up if the consequences are potentially very real, obviously. All right, so now the slides look a little bit flashy in pink with what to do, question mark, because yes, I think overall we can see there's definitely reduction of the administrative burden. I mean, a lot of the trips that your people, your audience will probably be making will be ending up in the A1 certificate exemption box. Amazing. Because today hardly any trip ends up in the exemption box. There is no official exemption. Technically, every trip requires an A1. So I think that is a reduction of the administrative burden. However, pushed by the fact that there is the obligation now, the hard obligation on the other side, there's still a couple of things that you need to do, also taking into consideration that, like Frank already touched upon before, the exemptions, of course, it remains law, and law always has technicalities to it. And as you saw for the first exemption, you have to start counting, right? You have to count accumulated days of work in the destination. You have to maybe even put in an expectation, like, is Frank going to go to Italy again later this month? Yes or no? And that's a topic. And it all starts with an overall obligation or requirement, basically, in order to do the A1, to apply the A1 exemption in the correct way and make sure you actually comply with the obligation for those trips that have this obligation. You have to track your trips. Of course, clients of WorkFlex already have this, so no problem, but there's still more companies that are not a client of WorkFlex than there are clients of WorkFlex, and so they might not have a trip tracking process in place. Look, there's a booking platform usually, but GM or HR is quite often not really connected, so they have no clue where their people are. That's an impossibility going forward. You'll have to know where your people are. You have to track the trips. And like I said, you have to count the accumulated days of work. Just do the assessment. You also need to do the assessment for the trip purpose in order to answer the question correctly. Is this a business trip in the sense of the EC regulation? Yes or no? And last but not least, besides tracking, counting, and assessing trip purpose, obviously you actually need to do the application in time. I just said there are still more companies that are not a client of WorkFlex than there are clients of WorkFlex. I think also there are still more companies in the world that do not do A1 applications at all versus companies that actually do. That will be gone in latest or in around 2 years from now. You will have to do those applications, in fact. So those are the 4 things that you definitely need to do.
Hey, Peter, just a quick question from Riddhi. She's asking how this is changing the remote work landscape. And I think especially remote work, we've said it's not classified as business trip, correct?
Correct. A workation or work from anywhere is not a business trip. So as soon as the workation is longer than 3 days, in that consecutive time period of 30 days, right, then it would require an A1. Really, in general, on remote work, if you're talking a little bit more structural remote work, so not just a workation, not just a business trip, but someone actually works remotely for an indefinite period of time. There are a couple of changes also in the EC regulations around this, but they're not related to the A1s. That's why they're not covered by this webinar right now. But happy to talk about it. There are some fundamental changes to the EC regulations and the Social Security coordination, for instance, for remote workers or commuters, included in the amendment procedure as well. All right, last slide until we go to the Q&A. So if you have any questions left, please put them in the chat. We've got 9 minutes left, so I think we're looking good on time. Just want to wrap this one up. So yes, there will be an A1 exemption. At least the expectation is if the EC regulation amendments are adopted anytime soon. And the exception is great. However, you've also seen there's going to be an obligation, which is not so great and a really hard requirement. And this requires you to do 4 things: trip tracking, counting, assessing trip purpose, and actually do the A1s then, of course. But it's also very important to, well, cutting the noise out. If this amendment goes through and it goes through unchanged, only then we will see these changes, and it will still take a couple of years until they actually take effect. And until then, you'd theoretically be required to do A1s anyway. And of course, I wouldn't be at WorkFlex if I wasn't to recommend, well, use the time, right, to get the processes in place anyway. Make sure you're compliant long before these amendments actually go live. So now you know the latest on the current amendment procedure. Stay tuned for more news, of course, because it will take a couple of months before there's more clarity on it. But this is exactly how things are proposed at the moment and the status of the amendment procedure. So I hope this was informative. And if anyone has any remaining questions, Frank, you've been able to keep an eye on the chat, I think. Then this is the moment to ask them.
Thanks, Peter. There's another question. Is there a maximum limit on how many days employees can work or be in the EU for after the A1 certificate has been received? So basically, how long is the A1 certificate valid is the question.
Yeah, so business trips will usually cover no problem. So there's different types of A1s, right? If you just look at the regular A1, I think it can be up to 24 months, in some cases up to 36 months. So it can be very, very long. As an example, I myself was an expat from the Netherlands to Germany, and I had an A1 that lasted for the full period of the assignment, which was 2 years. So obviously we're talking here business trips, which are in 99.9% of the time, they're shorter than 183 days. And so their coverage duration can still be relatively long, but maybe also a misconception today. We see clients or potential clients also saying, look, we've got this multi-state A1 that also works, right? No. Business travelers are hardly multi-state workers. Like there's very strict requirements for you to be a multi-state worker and being able to get a different type of A1 other than the A1 for each specific trip. So if the question has the background of, well, I've got a couple of travelers left and right, what I'll just do on January 1st, 2020, what is it, 9 or so, I'll just get them for the full 24-month period. It's not how it works. You need to get A1s on a per trip basis. That's the bad news. The good news is, look, we at WorkFlex, we've automated the entire process. We're connected to your booking tool. So as soon as the trip comes in, we assess it. We say there's an A1 obligation. By the time you receive the news, you are obliged to apply for an A1. We've already done it for you. And we get you the right individual trip A1.
Thanks, Peter. I think so. It's not possible, as you said, to just basically give everyone a 2-year A1 and then you'll save for the next 2 years. So that's unfortunately not how it works. Here's another question. It's more about a kind of cooling off period for A1. How will reassignments from one country, maybe ending in 24 months, then moving into a different country, what will be the waiting period in the home country before they can qualify again for another A1 in a different jurisdiction? I think.
Yeah, so I think already today, and I don't think there's an amendment for it. It's 3 months. So what does this mean, dear audience? Like, you can only request for an A1 if you've been socially secured in that country for at least 3 months, if I get the question correctly. So it's a little bit of an exceptional case because the vast majority of people, like Frank, for instance, he's socially insured in Germany, like on an ongoing basis, so it doesn't really change. But in some cases, new joiners or people that recently relocated, they might not qualify yet for an A1. So you may not be able to get it. That is let's say, a special case that already exists today, and that's going to be still there also after go live of the amendments.
Yeah. We have another question from Jenny. Going to one country for, let's say, 2 days and to another country the week after for 3 days. Should these be calculated together considering the amount of days? So I think that refers to the 3-day threshold.
Yeah, good question, Jenny. Logically, because it's not entirely clear at the moment, so logically, these would, like, you're counting the 3 consecutive days of work in that specific country. I'm not entirely sure. And of course, if the answer to your question would be no, the entire travel within the EU region, where there's also something to say for, right? It's an EU regulation, after all, that will significantly reduce the number of trips that are exempted for this A1. My expectation would be we're talking on a route basis, so Germany to Italy, and as soon as there's also a trip to Spain, we're talking something different. And I think that's also in the spirit of the law, because basically the idea is you're going to work on a specific project or topic for a longer period of time, and the question is, should Frank be socially secured in Italy, maybe, yes or no? And the question is not so much, now Frank is also going to be in Spain for a few days, like how does that relate? But yeah, guarantee until we stop this webinar in 3 minutes, because it's unclear at the moment, the exact details.
Yeah, we have a short question from Monica. Basically, what happens with countries like Switzerland that are not part of the EU?
Very good question, and sorry, I should have mentioned that proactively myself, but thank you very much, Monica. Yeah, so the Switzerland, the UK, Norway, they're not part of the EU. They're part of the, let's say, the region, and they work with the A1 system, more or less, to date. For as far as I know, they're not part of the provisional agreement. They're not invited to those discussions, or rather, they don't want to be invited to those discussions. And the big question is, will they first agree with what's being suggested, and will they adopt? Second question, when? I'm thinking that, look, for instance, the UK and Norway, they will probably adopt the new A1 regulation or the A1 changes as well, and I'm expecting them to do that within the transformation period of 24 months. As Switzerland is a different case, right? So if you look at PWD notifications, which is ultimately a little bit where this thing goes to, right? Trips that require PWD will definitely require an A1, and some more trips as well. But Switzerland says, fundamentally, we want PWDs for like the vast majority of trips. So why would they go with a system or an amendment of a regulation that will exempt many trips that for them do still require a PWD, but then do no longer require an A1? That's unclear. So for Switzerland, we have our doubts at WorkFlex. And very important also to mention is that there are also countries that, for trips that have a PWD obligation, that part of the PWD is that you've requested an A1. And nothing is said about this topic and how it relates to each other in the current amendment procedure. So yeah, the expectation is, I could have actually added to the slide here, is that as soon as a PWD requires an A1, it would probably still fall into an A1 certificate obligation bucket, not necessarily for the reason of A1 legislation, but rather for the reason of PWD legislation.
Hey, Peter, do we still have time, or I think we're running out, huh?
Yeah, we can do still one short question if there's left.
One short one, I would say, Thomas, in reflection of Riti's question, can you please clarify again the necessity of an A1 form for vocations? Is this a requirement already or a proposal?
It's already a requirement. So the current obligation around A1s, the bad news is it's for every trip. At the moment, you need an A1 for every trip. Very simple, full stop. That's exactly the reason why they're trying to change it now, because this very clear, blunt obligation, they want to get rid of it. The bad news, or that's the bad news. The good news of today is that you can theoretically request for an A1 also retrospectively. So that softens the obligation a little bit. And that is also going to change. So The good news is going forward, looks like it at least, you will not have to do an A1 for a quite good number of trips. However, for those trips that need an A1, you will have this hard obligation. So basically both the good and bad news, there are some twists to it. And with that, we have reached the end of this webinar. If there's any other questions, then of course, feel free to just ping us or ping your contact person at WorkFlex. We will keep you posted on any news in this area. If you want to learn more about the WorkFlex platform, of course, please feel free also to reach out to our team. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you very much for all the questions. That really makes it fun. And looking forward to seeing you again. Bye-bye.
Bye.